Have you ever noticed how millennials and Gen Z can look almost identical on the surface, yet think completely differently? Both grew up with the internet, both experienced social media, both lived through rapid technological change, and yet one generation says work hard, stay stable, build a career, and the other says nothing feels real anymore. One generation grew up trying to survive the system. The other grew up questioning whether the system was even worth joining. And the strange part is, sometimes the age gap between them is only a few years, but psychologically, they often feel worlds apart. Why? Because generations are not shaped by age. They're shaped by environment. And millennials and Gen Z grew up in completely different psychological environments. Millennials witnessed the rise of the internet. Gen Z was born inside it. Millennials remember a world before constant connection. Gen Z barely experienced a world without it. That difference changed attention, identity, relationships, ambition, humor, anxiety, almost everything. And once you notice these differences, you start understanding why both generations often misunderstand each other. The first major difference appears in attention itself. Millennials experienced the internet as a tool. Gen Z experienced it as an atmosphere. Millennials still remember boredom, actual boredom, sitting in a room staring at the ceiling because there was simply nothing else to do. Gen Z grew up with stimulation available every second. Music, videos, memes, notifications, endless scrolling. And when your brain grows up in an environment of constant stimulation, attention changes. Not because Gen Z is lazy or broken, because the brain adapts to its environment. Fast content trains fast attention. That's why Gen Z often multitasks constantly. Watching something while texting someone, while scrolling something else, while emotionally processing a crisis through memes, which is honestly impressive and slightly terrifying at the same time. Millennials adapted to the internet. Gen Z adapted to overstimulation. And that psychological difference affects everything from patience to focus to emotional regulation. The second major difference is career psychology. Millennials were raised with a very specific promise. Study hard, get a stable job, build a life. That promise shaped their psychology deeply. Success meant stability, security, predictability. But then many millennials watched economic instability hit in real time. Recessions, layoffs, rising living costs, burnout culture. So millennials became psychologically attached to work, but also deeply exhausted by it. Gen Z saw all of this happen while growing up, and psychologically, that changed their relationship with ambition entirely. Many Gen Z individuals don't dream of climbing corporate ladders. They dream of escaping them, not because they hate success, because they watched older generations sacrifice mental health for systems that often didn't protect them anyway. That's why Gen Z is more likely to prioritize flexibility, freedom, and emotional well-being over traditional career status. And honestly, from a psychological perspective, that shift makes sense. Millennials were taught stability exists. Gen Z grew up watching stability collapse online in real time. The next difference is emotional expression. Millennials grew up in a culture where emotional vulnerability still carried stigma. You were expected to deal with it, push through, keep going. That mentality created resilience in many ways, but it also created emotional suppression. Gen Z grew up during a very different cultural shift. Mental health conversations became mainstream. Therapy language entered social media. People openly discussed anxiety, burnout, trauma, identity, and emotional struggles online. As a result, Gen Z became psychologically more emotionally expressive. But there's another side to this. Sometimes emotional awareness turns into emotional hyper-awareness. Constant self-analysis, constant emotional labeling, constant internal monitoring. Millennials often ignored emotions. Gen Z sometimes over-monitors them. Both are psychological adaptations to different environments, and neither side fully understands the other. Millennials sometimes see Gen Z as overly sensitive. Gen Z sometimes sees millennials as emotionally disconnected, but underneath both reactions is the same thing: adaptation. One generation survived by suppressing emotion, the other survived by analyzing it. And if you're enjoying the video so far, please subscribe to the channel. Another fascinating difference appears in humor. This one is subtle, but incredibly revealing psychologically. Millennial humor was often optimistic, awkward, and self-aware. Gen Z humor sometimes feels like existential chaos compressed into 7 seconds. And there's a reason for that. Humor reflects emotional environments. Millennials used humor socially. Gen Z often uses humor defensively. Irony became emotional armor. Absurdity became coping. That's why Gen Z humor sometimes feels intentionally confusing. It mirrors the feeling of growing up in a world that already feels confusing. Climate anxiety, economic uncertainty, information overload, identity pressure, constant comparison. When reality itself starts feeling unstable, humor becomes stranger too. Sometimes the joke is not even the joke anymore. The joke is that everyone is exhausted and pretending everything is normal. Psychologically, that creates a generation that often processes discomfort through detachment and irony, which explains why Gen Z can joke about burnout while actively burning out. The next major difference is identity. Millennials explored identity mostly through real-world environments: school, friend groups, workplaces, physical social circles. Gen Z developed identity while being constantly observed online. That changes psychology dramatically. Imagine forming your personality while being exposed to millions of opinions, aesthetics, trends, lifestyles, and comparisons every single day. It creates much higher self-awareness, but also much higher self-consciousness. Millennials asked, "Who am I?" Gen Z often asks, "How am I perceived?" That difference matters because social media transformed identity into performance. Profiles became curated versions of self. Personalities became visible. Interests became aesthetic categories. And when identity becomes public, self-expression changes psychologically. People become more aware of judgment, more aware of comparison, more aware of how they appear instead of simply how they feel. That constant visibility creates pressure older generations never experienced at the same intensity. Another major difference is relationships. Millennials still experience slower connection, waiting for texts, long conversations, more offline interaction. Gen Z grew up inside instant communication, and strangely, constant connection sometimes created more emotional distance because accessibility changes emotional dynamics. When everyone is always available, interactions can start feeling disposable. Attention becomes fragmented. Conversations become shorter, dating becomes algorithmic, ghosting becomes normal, and psychologically, abundance changes attachment. When people feel replaceable, vulnerability becomes harder. That's why many Gen Z individuals crave deep connection while simultaneously struggling to trust permanence. Millennials feared losing opportunities. Gen Z often fears emotional instability itself. And then there's the biggest difference of all: optimism. Millennials grew up during a period where the future still felt relatively structured. Gen Z grew up during constant uncertainty, global crisis, information overload, economic pressure, social media comparison, rapid technological change, a constant feeling that the world is moving too fast. Psychologically, that changes how people think about life itself. Millennials often approached adulthood with expectation. Gen Z often approaches adulthood with uncertainty. That's why many Gen Z individuals feel mentally exhausted early. Not because they're weak, because psychologically they were exposed to more information, comparison, and instability at younger ages than any generation before them. And yet, despite all these differences, both generations are reacting to the same deeper thing: a rapidly changing world. They simply adapted differently. Millennials adapted by pushing through. Gen Z adapted by questioning everything. One learned endurance. The other learned awareness. One says, "keep going." The other says, "but why?" And honestly, both perspectives contain truth because every generation develops psychological survival strategies based on the environment it inherits. That's why generational conflict often misses the point. People act as if one generation became different by choice, but psychology rarely develops in isolation. It develops through environment, technology, culture, economics, fear, pressure, connection. And if Gen Z sometimes feels emotionally overwhelmed, it's because they grew up psychologically overloaded. If millennials sometimes seem emotionally detached, it's because many were taught emotional survival through suppression. Different worlds, different conditioning, different minds. And maybe the most important thing to understand is this: neither generation is completely right. Neither generation is completely wrong. They are simply reflections of the worlds that shape them. Because human psychology always adapts, even when the adaptation looks strange from the outside. Please like and subscribe.